Let's not make this awkward. Just take the photo. You're not really part of the picture anyway. That's what my niece said on the day they celebrated 3 generations of our family. Not in anger, not to be cruel. She said it casually, like giving directions to a stranger. And that's exactly what I had become. They were all there that afternoon. The living room was filled with polished shoes, matching outfits, and the scent of expensive food catered in for the occasion. There was laughter, loud, rich, confident. The kind that fills a house and pushes out anyone who doesn't match its rhythm. Someone suggested a group photo. Phones came out. Chairs were pulled into position. People began fixing their collars, smoothing their dresses, adjusting each other's hair. Then my nephew turned to me, half smiling, phone in hand. "You're good with tech, right, Uncle Dan? Could you take the shot?" I stood there just behind the couch, holding a plate I hadn't touched. My jacket still smelled faintly of sawdust and autumn rain. I'd arrived late, straight from the job site. I hadn't even had time to change. I looked around. No one else offered. No one even looked in my direction except to hand me the phone. So I nodded, quietly, like always. I stepped back. They posed. Big smiles, linked arms, proud faces. 4 generations of pride, captured in one frame. Except me. I wasn't in it. I was behind it, holding the phone steady, capturing a moment I wasn't invited to live in. Click. The flash went off. They cheered. No one turned to say thank you. As they reviewed the photo, one of them chuckled. "He's got a good eye. Maybe he should be the family photographer full time." And someone else added, "Yeah, at least that way he'll feel useful." Laughter followed. Sharp, quick, forgettable for them, unforgettable for me. I stepped out into the backyard after that. The cold bit at my hands, but I preferred it to the warmth that had turned me invisible. It wasn't the first time. Every gathering, every wedding, every celebration, I was the one behind the lens, behind the barbecue, behind the repairs, behind the favors, behind the family. I stood under the leafless tree near the edge of the fence, and for the first time in years, I asked myself a question I had buried deep. What would happen if I just stopped showing up? Would they notice? Would they even pause to wonder who used to hold the camera? Or would someone else just take my place, without the history, without the years, without the sacrifice? I thought about the house they were standing in, the walls I patched, the kitchen I renovated, the loan I took out, the time I worked 3 jobs to make sure we could keep it during the crash. None of that was in the photo, just smiles, and me behind it all forgotten. That night, I saved the picture. Not for them, for me. Because I knew one day they would look back on that photo and ask, "Where were you, Uncle Dan?" And when they did, I'd be ready. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with the truth and the title deed. Friends, let me pause for just a moment. Where are you listening from? Have you ever felt something like this? Left out of the very picture you helped build? Share your story in the comments. I read them all. And if this touched something in you, please consider subscribing and sharing this video. It truly helps us grow this channel and bring more stories like this to life. Now, let's continue. They toasted that night in the living room. Glasses raised, voices proud, stories swirling through the air like steam from a kitchen I built with my own hands. The chandelier flickered above them, the one I'd wired during a winter storm when the electrician bailed last minute. The oak floors creaked softly beneath their polished shoes. The same floors I laid one board at a time. Knees raw, palms blistered. The fireplace crackled in the corner, trimmed with stone I hauled myself from 2 counties over. And yet as the speeches began, my name never left their lips. "This home is a symbol of new beginnings," said my nephew, his voice steady, rehearsed. Dad made it all possible. His vision, his investment, everything we see around us. Applause followed. Pats on the back. More toast. Smiles that said, "We've done well." And me? I sat in the hallway next to the shoe rack, sipping water from a paper cup because the real glasses were all for guests. I didn't correct them. I didn't stand up to say that their vision was my sweat, that the down payment came from a loan I took out in my name, that the investment was my retirement, cashed in quietly when the bank almost took the land, that when they were on vacation in Mexico, I was on the roof, hammering shingles back into place after the hurricane tore half of it off. I didn't say any of it, because if you say it too early, it sounds like pride, and if you say it too late, it sounds like bitterness. So I said nothing at all, just listened, Listened as the uncle who never showed up was praised for the design idea he saw once on Pinterest. Listened as the cousin who oversaw the renovation was thanked for managing a team he only called twice. And listened as I was mentioned once, not by name, just a passing joke. You know, if the lights go out, we can always call Dan. Laughter, real laughter, the kind that doesn't know it's cutting. That was my role, not the architect, not the backbone, the backup. The guy you call when the heat goes out, the sink leaks, the fuse blows, needed but never known, seen but never included. I stepped outside halfway through the evening, lit a cigarette I didn't intend to finish. The porch creaked beneath me, another one of my repairs. The air was cold, but not colder than the space I'd just left. I looked at the house, at the lights I wired, at the walls I painted, at the front door I installed when they said the old one just didn't feel like home. Funny how I was trusted to build the home, but never welcomed into it. I remembered the day the foundation was poured. It was me and one other worker. Rain fell sideways, mud everywhere, but I stayed because deadlines don't care about weather, and family doesn't wait for gratitude. And now, years later, they toasted to a dream home, never wondering whose dreams were sacrificed to make it real. I didn't cry. I didn't clench my fist. I just stood there, letting the wind remind me I was still here. Still solid, still present, still whole. Because even if they never say my name, this house knows it. The walls remember the hands that built them. The floor remembers every step I took. Early mornings, late nights, tools in hand, back aching. And one day, they'll remember too. Not because I raised my voice, but because the ground they stand on will start to shift. And they'll realize it was never theirs to begin with. The doorbell rang, and with it came voices. Cheerful, polished, practiced. Neighbors, friends of the family. People who hadn't seen the mess behind the paint, who only knew the house in its finished state, never in the aching process it once was. I was in the kitchen when they arrived, wiping down a counter no one asked me to clean. It was something to do with my hands, better than clenching them. What a beautiful home, one woman said, stepping in with a bottle of wine wrapped in gold ribbon. Ah, stunning work, added her husband, looking around the living room, where every beam, every panel, every coat of paint carried a piece of my back. I waited for it, the part where someone would nod in my direction, a glance, a gesture, a word. But all I heard was my nephew. Yeah, my dad made it happen, all him. And someone else added. Of course, the whole family pitched in, but it was really their vision, you know? Their vision. Their hands. Their name. I was still in the room, still breathing, still warm, but already being erased. The woman noticed me finally. She smiled politely, unsure, and asked, "And who's this?" My niece stepped forward. "Oh, that's Uncle Dan. He helps around the house, fixes things." Then, almost as a joke, "Our very own live-in handyman." Laughter, shrinking laughter. I was no longer the man who signed the original property loan. No longer the uncle who paid the taxes during the pandemic when they couldn't. I wasn't the silent guarantor. I was the help. I wiped my hands on the cloth and nodded. Didn't speak. Didn't break. But inside, something folded. Something quiet and long-suffering, finally tired. Not angry. Exhausted. I remember the nights I worked double shifts, trading sleep for savings. The holidays I skipped because the house needed finishing before winter. The trips I never took because they needed just a little more help this month. Years without vacations. Birthdays forgotten. Health appointments postponed. So they could walk on warm floors and drink wine under safe roofs. And now, in the stories they told to strangers, I wasn't a builder. I wasn't even family. I was function. A tool. A convenience wrapped in skin. He helps around the house. The phrase looped in my mind like a bell I couldn't unhear. That night, as I washed the dishes alone, I listened to their voices through the wall, telling stories of grit, of ambition, of how far we've come. I could hear the pride dripping from every sentence. And I thought, is this how legacy dies? Not with betrayal, but with omission? Not with a fight, but with a shrug? I dried my hands, turned off the faucet, and walked to the garage where the old paperwork was still stored in a fireproof box. Deed, tax records, bank wires, all of it, in my name. Still valid, still untouched. They had erased me from the conversation. But I still held the ink that signed the foundation. And one day when the truth breaks through the polite lies they tell their guests, they'll have to answer not to me, but to the paper they never thought to read. They called me again. Same voice, same tone, same casual dismissal wrapped in a joke. Uncle Dan, can you take another one? That last shot cut off Aunt Lydia's head. Laughter. I nodded like always. I stood behind the phone they shoved into my hand. No case. Cracked at the edge. No please. No thank you. Just the assumption that I would do what I always do. Serve the moment without ever being part of it. They positioned themselves on the stairs this time. 4 generations, they said. Grandparents in the middle, the kids around them, the youngest sitting cross-legged up front, matching sweaters, forced grins, a banner behind them that said, Family First. They adjusted each other's collars, straightened sleeves, moved vases and pillows and shadows so everything looked perfect. No one turned to see if I was in the frame. No one asked, do you want to be in this one? No one even made space, because why would they? I was the background, the man who held the button, the one whose stories never made it into the captions. So I stepped back, lifted the phone, centered the shot, and just before pressing the shutter, I paused. I looked at them, not as family this time, but as subjects. A room full of smiles that had learned to live without me. Children I had rocked to sleep. Adults I had carried through seasons they now claim as their own. Laughter in a house I wired. Joy beneath a roof I rebuilt twice. And suddenly the frame felt dishonest. Too clean, too curated, too hollow. Because the only thing missing from that image was the man who made it possible. And then I pressed the button. The flash lit up the room. They laughed, turned to each other, checking their hair, their expressions. Someone shouted, "Send that to the family group." But as I looked at the screen, at the frozen smiles and posed hands, I didn't see a memory. I saw a lie, a portrait of legacy, with its architect erased. I hit save, but not to share it. Not this time. I saved it as evidence, not of pride, but of silence. Because in that moment, standing behind the camera, I realized something that changed everything. They can have their picture, but I hold the lens, and I choose what gets captured, what gets remembered, what gets left out, and more than that. I choose the story that comes after the photo is taken. One day they'll point to this picture and say, "That was the whole family," and someone will ask, "Who took it?" And maybe then they'll feel the weight of what it cost to not include the man who made the moment possible. The flash may have captured their smiles, but my absence is what gives the photo its truth. Because I wasn't just behind the camera. I was holding the frame of the very life they stood in. And one day, when they finally understand what that means, it will be too late to crop me back in. That night, long after the last guest had gone and the house had gone quiet, except for the distant clinking of empty glasses being stacked in the kitchen, I sat alone in the small spare room upstairs, my coat still on, my hands still stained faintly with the day's work. I pulled the old box from the closet. It was heavier than I remembered, not in weight but in memory. Inside were albums, some yellowed with time, others wrapped in protective plastic I had carefully added over the years, each one marked with a date, each one full of captured moments. I opened the first one, the earliest, the days when we broke ground on the land, back when it was just mud and sky. There I was, covered in cement dust, crouched beside rebar, squinting into sunlight, but not really there, because someone else had taken the photo. I turned the page. Another image, the frame of the house rising plank by plank, and there I stood, in the distance, almost out of focus, holding a beam above my head. No one labeled the photo, no caption, just Summer '03. The next album, early years of the family moving in, birthday cakes, fireworks, first steps, holidays, laughter frozen mid-air, candles caught mid-flicker, decorations I hung, tables I built, gifts I wrapped. But nowhere was I at the center, not even beside them. I was always on the edge, the one holding the camera, or the one blurred in the background, or not in the frame at all. I paused at one photo, Christmas morning, everyone in matching pajamas gathered around the tree, the kids glowing, parents smiling. I remember that day. I'd spent the night before assembling the toy kitchen, gluing together tiny wooden parts until my fingers cramped. They never knew I slept 3 hours. But the gifts were perfect. The photo was perfect. I turned the page. Summer barbecue. Everyone seated. Laughter mid-bite. I was at the grill that day. The smoke had made my eyes sting. My feet were blistered from standing 10 hours. In the photo, only the plates I filled. No sign of me. I kept flipping, year after year, page after page, event after event, and with each turn the ache grew heavier. It wasn't just that I was missing from the photos. It was that I was missing from the memories they chose to keep. My presence was in the work, the background, the labor, but not in the love, not in the remembering. I closed the last album slowly, my fingers tracing the spine as if trying to hold on to something I never fully had. And then I sat there, staring at the pile of photos that never told the truth, because pictures are supposed to capture what matters. But these only captured what they noticed. And I had spent a lifetime giving my time, my body, my name, for moments I was never invited into. Tears didn't fall. They didn't need to, because something deeper burned in me that night. Not grief, not rage, resolve. If no one thought to turn the camera around, then maybe it was time I stopped waiting to be seen. Maybe it was time to build something else. Not a house, not a room, not another place for them to stand and smile and forget. Maybe this time I'd build a story where I was in the center. And if no one else remembered, then I would. Because memory doesn't belong to those who pose. It belongs to those who showed up. Even when no one pointed the lens. Dinner was loud that evening. The long oak table, the one I had sanded and stained with my own hands years ago, was full of food, of stories, of the illusion of closeness. Plates clinked, glasses were refilled, chairs scraped the floor as people leaned in toward each other, talking over one another like it was a contest of who belonged more. I sat near the end, not the head, not the center, just there, like a placeholder in my own creation. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, gravy, everything laid out perfectly. The kind of meal they'd once called a feast, when I cooked it on a broken stove in the middle of winter, with nothing but love and borrowed seasoning. Now catered, convenient, polished food for polished people. They were already planning the next family photo. A new one. The big one, someone said. The one that would go in the living room frame, above the mantel I installed alone in the dead of night when no one else showed up. Names were suggested, positions debated. Let's do by generation. Grandparents in the middle. Yes. Cousins on the stairs. Laughter followed. Napkins waved like flags. I smiled quietly and kept cutting my food. Then casually, so casually it didn't even feel like a question, one of the teenage grandsons said it. Why would he be in the family portrait? The words dropped like a pebble in a still lake. Not loud, but unmistakable. The room froze just for a second, then caught itself and kept moving. A few chuckled. Someone cleared their throat. Another muttered, "Oh, come on," but didn't make eye contact. No one stopped the conversation. No one looked my way to say, "Of course he's in it." No one said my name. No one said anything. I looked down at my plate. The food had gone cold. My fork, still in my hand, felt heavier than steel. I laid it down quietly, the sound of metal on porcelain louder than all the laughter that came before. I didn't look up, not because I was ashamed, but because I suddenly saw them too clearly. All of them. The family I built, the family I carried, the family that now laughed at the idea that I belonged in the frame. I sat there unmoving as their conversations picked back up, not because they forgot what was said, but because ignoring it was easier than admitting that somewhere along the way they had stopped seeing me as part of them, not because I wasn't there, but because I was always there, always available, always helpful, always standing just outside the spotlight, holding everything up while they posed. And now, after years of showing up, of sacrificing birthdays, sleep, comfort, time, my reward was a table where I was fed but not valued, included but not invited, seated but not seen. I rose from the table slowly, pushed the chair in, no words, no scene. Because dignity doesn't raise its voice. And as I walked toward the hallway, I passed the empty wall where they planned to hang the new family portrait. And I thought, let them have their photo. Let them frame their curated joy, their edited memory. Because the truth wasn't in the picture. It was in the silence after that boy's question. It was in the eyes that looked away. It was in the way no one said, "He is family?" So I left my plate untouched. And I left the room, not as a man excluded, but as a man awakening. Because if I was never meant to be in their picture, then maybe it was time to take myself out of their story altogether and write my own, where I didn't have to beg for space, where I didn't need permission to belong. The house was quiet when I returned to my room. The kind of quiet that only follows a choice. The kind of quiet that isn't peace, but distance. Their voices were still faint in the background, someone laughing, someone pouring another drink, a playlist murmuring through the speakers downstairs. They had moved on, as always. The moment that had cut me had already dissolved into the next round of dessert. But I hadn't moved on. Not tonight, not this time. I sat on the edge of the bed, in the room they never came into. Not because it was off limits, but because there was nothing in it for them. No comfort, no status, no photo-worthy furniture. Just a bed I had assembled alone. A lamp with a fading bulb, and a drawer full of papers no one ever asked about. I reached for the drawer and pulled it open slowly. The smell of old ink and dry wood filled the air. Inside, receipts folded tight, letters never mailed, photocopies of tax filings, permits, and contracts. A life lived in transactions, a lifetime proven on paper if nowhere else. At the bottom, under years of forgotten forms, was the one document that mattered most. I slid it out with care, smoothing its creased edge across my knee. Thick stock paper, black ink, stamped and sealed. Unmistakable, unquestionable. Title deed, property owner, Daniel M. Reyes. My name. My full name, not Uncle Dan, not the handyman, not the helper, owner. I stared at it for a long time, not reading it, remembering it. I remembered the day I first signed the documents. The way the banker hesitated before saying, "You sure you want to put this in just your name?" And I had nodded, not because I was sure, but because I knew no one else was going to carry the risk. No one else was going to take the debt. No one else was going to spend the next 15 years trading comfort for stability. I remembered the weeks of waiting for the loan approval, the nights I couldn't sleep, wondering if the roof would collapse before I could afford to fix it, the meals I skipped, the jobs I juggled, the quiet victories no one clapped for, and I remembered the day we moved the family in. They called it a fresh start, said how lucky we were, said how generous it was of them to take me in, and I stayed silent, not because I was ashamed, but because I had never needed recognition. I only wanted a place where we could all be safe, where no one went cold in the winter, where the lights stayed on even when life got dark. But now, as I held that document in my hands, I saw the cost of my silence. Because when you don't tell your story, they write it for you, and they had rewritten mine into something smaller, something forgettable, something they could edit out of the picture. But paper doesn't lie. Not this paper. Not the paper with the ink that made the house a home. Not the paper that proved what no one else would say. I built this. I paid for this. I own this. Not out of ego. Out of love. A love that worked in shadows, that hammered and lifted and bled in silence. A love they misunderstood as servitude. I folded the deed back slowly, placed it back in the drawer, closed it gently, not to hide it, to protect it, because one day they'll need answers. They'll ask questions. They'll wonder who signed the forms, who kept the house during the hard years, who made sure their children had bedrooms and heat and walls that didn't leak. And that day when the myths start to crack, when the stories no longer match the facts, when they turn and say, "Wait, but who owns this?" the paper will answer for me, not with bitterness, not with volume, just with truth, the kind I no longer needed to shout, because it had already been signed and sealed and waiting in the drawer. The whole time, I remember the day I signed the will as vividly as I remember the day I poured the foundation. It was a gray morning, the kind that presses the sky low and makes the world feel smaller. I stood in the notary's office, a sterile room of glass and gray carpeting, clutching a pen that trembled only with purpose. Behind me, the door clicked shut. Ahead of me, a single sheet of paper that carried more weight than any brick I'd ever laid. On that page there were no familiar names, no beloved daughter, no son-in-law, no darling grandchildren. Instead, there was one name, mine, followed by instructions that mapped the future of the house they celebrated, without me. Every revision I made in the privacy of that office was a silent correction to the stories they told at weddings and birthdays. Every time they erased me from their anecdotes, I quietly altered the will, not out of spite, but out of survival. Not to punish them, but to protect myself. They've never read it. They've never asked. They're too busy pointing to the living room plaque, family home, built with love. without ever recognizing whose hands built its walls. They're too comfortable believing that love meant a shared title, when all along it meant quiet sacrifice. In my mind, I see the notary's face, polite and unreadable as she stamped the document. I hear the echo of her heels walking away down the hallway, as if sealing a secret. I felt the cold weight of that moment settle in my chest. Here was proof that I belonged, on paper when they refused to say so aloud. Tonight, as the house thrums with laughter and careless toasts, I carry that will in my pocket. It presses against my hip like a rebuke. Every time their voices float up from below, I remind myself that the deed proved ownership, and the will proves intention. One secures the walls, the other secures the heart of what stands within. They don't know how close they are to learning the truth. They don't see that the quiet man in the hallway, the silent fixer of leaky roofs, is the one who decides what happens here when they can no longer pretend I don't exist. They think inheritance is about bloodline, but it's about recognition, and I have all the legal recognition I need. Soon the celebration will end. The toasts will fade, the guests will leave, and the household will face a new reality. The papers at the notary, unchanged for months, will come into play, and in that moment, they'll realize that the story they wrote for themselves omitted its greatest architect. They'll read the will. They'll see I excluded every name because I never belonged in their narrative as they wrote it. And at last, they'll discover what I always knew. Ownership doesn't just live in walls and roofs. It lives in the truth you're brave enough to record. Another week, another family celebration, this time a backyard barbecue to welcome summer. I arrived with the camera slung over my shoulder, but this time my footsteps didn't carry the same weight of duty. They carried curiosity. They clustered beneath the awning, collars turned up against the sun, each of them with paper cups and plastic plates balanced carefully in their hands. Laughter bubbled over the sizzle of burgers on the grill. Children darted between legs, chasing foam balls. Music drifted lazily from a speaker perched high in a tree. It was perfect, just as they liked it. I stepped back, holding the camera at eye level, framing the shot. 3 generations laughing beneath a handmade banner, reading, family, and fun. I clicked the shutter, but my focus shifted beyond the frame. Instead of freezing an image, I studied everyone's faces. I watched the uncle who always takes credit for the renovation raise his glass and say, "We did this," insisting it was a collective triumph. The cousin who oversaw the budget nodded, smiling at himself for being named project manager, oblivious to the months I'd spent ankle-deep in mortar to keep the wall straight. I watched my sister lean over to thank my father for organizing everything, her voice dripping gratitude, and saw how he basked in her praise, unaware that the invitations, tables, and timelines had been my designs. I watched my nephew hoist his little brother onto his shoulders, shouting, "This is ours!" His eyes bright with ownership, but his words erased the hands that had raised the beams above them. And I watched the silent ones, the ones who caught my eye across the yard, lips pressed into thin lines as they noticed me there. I saw their hesitation. Do they thank the man behind the lens, or pretend he's invisible again? Only a few stepped forward. The oldest cousin shook my hand briefly, murmured a reluctant, "Thank you," but then drifted away. The neighbor who once asked me to fix his fence raised an eyebrow in recognition, then turned back to the larger circle, safer among his own. I stood still as the sun dipped lower, the late afternoon light softening edges and hiding imperfections. The house I built glowed warmly, every brick and beam a testament to things unseen. I lowered the camera and placed it around my neck. In that moment, I realized I was no longer gathering memories for them. I was gathering evidence of the lines they drew and the stories they told. I was collecting the moments when we excluded me, when thanks felt obligatory, when the notion of shared ownership left me out entirely. I exhaled slowly, stepping away from the crowd into the shade where no one looked. I didn't feel anger, I felt clarity. I had watched them celebrate a home they believed belonged to all of us, and I had seen who claimed credit and who merely provided the foundation. As laughter and chatter continued behind me, I lifted my chin, strode toward the gate, and knew that soon enough they would gather again. Not around a grill, but around the truth I had quietly recorded. And this time, they wouldn't be able to frame it any other way. The party had long ended. The last echoes of laughter were buried under stacked chairs, half-drained bottles, and empty bowls covered in plastic wrap. The yard was dark now, save for the porch light that flickered when the wind picked up, one of many things they still hadn't fixed. Inside, the house had fallen into its usual rhythm after company left. Quiet television murmurs, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of floorboards under retreating footsteps. I waited, not for attention, for timing. I found my nephew alone in the living room, scrolling mindlessly on his phone. The one who always bragged about how the family built everything from scratch. The one who once joked that I should get Employee of the Month. He didn't look up when I walked in. He didn't need to. I didn't ask. I didn't raise my voice. I just said, "Come upstairs, just for a minute." He followed, maybe out of politeness, maybe curiosity, maybe because somewhere deep down the tone in my voice felt different. We entered the room I never invited anyone into. The one with no decorations, no memories framed on the wall. Just one old desk, a chair, a flickering desk lamp. I sat down and opened the laptop. No explanations, no speeches. Just a folder, titled plainly Documents. I clicked it open, and then stepped aside. He leaned over, at first with the same casual posture he used when checking football scores, but then he began to read, PDF after PDF, scanned contracts, property assessments, loan agreements, tax records with my signature, dates stretching back nearly 2 decades, payment receipts, personal letters from banks, and finally, the deed, with my full name and no one else's. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. Then his voice broke the air like something fragile had cracked. "This is all yours?" I didn't answer, not right away. I let the silence do what words couldn't. Let the documents speak for the years my voice had been left out of every photo, every toast, every thank you speech that never came. His shoulders slowly dropped. He sat down beside me. I could see it happening. Not just surprise, but recalibration. His version of the story shifting like a house settling on its true foundation. They never said. His sentence trailed off, and I still said nothing. Because what do you say to someone who's only now realizing they were raised inside a home, built by a man they never thought to include? What do you say to a boy who once asked why I was behind the camera, and now sees that I was the frame? He clicked through the last few files. Bank transfers made when their mortgage fell behind. The time I paid off their medical bills anonymously. The check I sent for his college books when he thought it came from his father. His hands were shaking now. Not from guilt, he was still young, but from recognition. And that for the first time in years felt like enough. Not revenge, not reparation. Just one pair of eyes finally seeing what had always been in plain sight. He stood up slowly, his voice smaller. "Uncle Dan, why didn't you ever tell us?" I looked at him, not with anger, not with pain, with something closer to peace. Because telling isn't the same as being believed. And now finally you believe. He nodded. No more words. Just the heavy breath of someone carrying a new truth for the first time. And as he left the room, he glanced back once. Not to ask anything, not to fix anything. Just to acknowledge me. Fully. Finally. And in that simple, wordless glance, the shift began. The house felt different the next morning. The air wasn't heavy, but it was tense, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when clouds hang low and everything quiets down without knowing why. I stood in the kitchen, pouring coffee slowly, listening to the distant shuffle of feet on stairs and the occasional door that didn't quite close all the way. From the hallway I could hear voices, not full conversations, just snippets, half phrases, breathless pauses. They were whispering. It always starts with one person who saw the folder, one person who couldn't keep it to themselves. And now, the truth I had folded and buried in drawers, in sealed envelopes, in quiet gestures, it had surfaced. I heard someone near the stairwell say, "Wait, it's actually his?" Another voice, lower, uncertain, "That can't be right. Is it?" From upstairs, "He showed you the papers? Why would he keep that secret? Why wouldn't we know?" Because no one asked. That's why. Not once in all those years did anyone stop to wonder how the electricity stayed on during the winter when checks bounced. No one questioned who fixed the gutters at midnight before the storm hit. No one thought to ask how the taxes got paid when everyone else was out of work. Because it's easier to believe in blessings than sacrifice. Easier to wrap yourself in comfort and call it love than to trace it back to the hands that bled to provide it. Now, the truth had shattered their version of things, and they didn't know what to do with it. I didn't speak. Not during breakfast. Not when the kitchen filled with awkward greetings and eyes that didn't quite meet mine. But I felt it. The shift. No one dared bring it up directly. No one sat across from me and asked what they should have asked years ago. Was this always yours? Why did you let us pretend otherwise? Why didn't you stop us? Pride is a cruel thing. It would rather rewrite history than admit it overlooked the one man who made the story possible. I watched them move around the house differently now, more careful, more deliberate. They didn't speak to me, but they watched me. When I passed through the hallway, voices would dip low. When I entered a room, chairs shifted, conversations stopped. Not out of malice, but confusion. They didn't know how to place me anymore. I no longer fit the role they had assigned me, the quiet uncle, the helper, the background. Now I was the owner. The man with the paper that proved every assumption they made was built on convenience, not truth. Some avoided me. Others gave too much space, as if afraid that proximity might remind them of what they'd chosen not to see. But their eyes, those told the story, they looked at me like a puzzle they couldn't solve, like a photograph they'd taken 100 times, now realizing someone was missing from the frame, and it was never complete without him. No apologies came. Not yet. Just silence, dressed in glances. But I didn't need their words anymore, because I had something stronger now. I had presence. Not the kind that asks for acknowledgement, the kind that commands it without saying a single thing. Let them whisper. Let them gather in corners of hallways they believe are private. Let them search for language soft enough to carry shame and pride in the same breath. Because the truth is no longer a secret, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. They thought I didn't hear. They waited until late evening when the children were asleep and the lights in the hallway dimmed to that soft yellow hush that makes people feel safe to speak freely. They chose the dining room. How fitting. The same table where I had once served them meals, now used to serve up a conversation I was never supposed to hear. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but silence is a language I've learned to live in. And the walls of this house, they carry more than weight. They carry truth. Every word echoes if you've trained your ears long enough to listen. We need to figure out a way to talk to him, my niece whispered. It's not just about who's on the deed. This is our family home. We built memories here, someone added. He was part of it, yes, but that doesn't mean he should own it. He's not a manager, said another. He's always been more of a support role. I sat 2 rooms away in the old reading chair by the window, the same one I'd fixed 3 times because the legs kept splintering. The same chair no one ever thanked me for repairing. The shadows hid me well, but the words found me anyway. They were calm, careful, strategic, not a fight, a negotiation. They were already planning how to ask me to hand it over, politely, of course, respectfully with just enough guilt masked as gratitude. Maybe we tell him it's about unity, someone suggested. We say it feels wrong, that the papers divide the family. Unity. That was the word they always reached for when it was convenient, when they wanted something, when they needed a sacrifice. But unity never came from me. Not when I stayed behind on holidays to fix broken pipes. Not when I was asked to sleep on the couch because a cousin just needed a room for a few weeks. Not when I stood behind every photo with a camera in hand while they smiled without me. Now they were worried because the truth was on paper, and paper doesn't forget. And worse, it doesn't bend to family dynamics. It just feels wrong that he has control over everything. It's not even like he knows how to handle legal stuff. He should have just been proud to be part of it. They called it ours. They called me part of it. As if I was the wall, not the foundation. As if I was furniture, used, appreciated in function, but never honored in presence. I sat there, hands folded, breath steady. Not one tear fell. Not this time. Because this wasn't betrayal. This was confirmation. Of what I had known for years but hadn't dared admit. They were never going to choose me. Not unless they had to. Not unless the house came with my name and they couldn't tear it off the brick. Their words dug deep. But they didn't bury me. They unearthed something stronger. Not anger. not revenge. Resolve. Let them meet without me. Let them draw up plans, rehearse their softened speeches, search for the perfect balance between persuasion and guilt. Because I had already made my decision, long before the whispers, long before the laughter that never included me. I wouldn't give them the house, not because I wanted to punish them, but because I finally understood. You don't give away your voice to people who never asked what it cost you to stay quiet. I woke up before the sun. The house was still asleep, curtains drawn, floors quiet, the air heavy with that early morning stillness that holds everything in suspension. No footsteps yet, no clatter of spoons or humming voices or running sinks, just silence. I walked to the old printer in the corner of my room. It had dust on its edges and one blinking light. I opened the folder on my computer, the same one I had used 100 times to print receipts, permits, loan confirmations. But this time, I selected only one file. The photo, the one they had begged me to take. The one they had arranged so carefully, 4 generations in color-coordinated outfits, 4 smiles, not a single empty space on the staircase, except the one behind the camera, where I stood. I printed it, waited as the paper slid out, warm, curling at the edges. I held it in my hands for a moment, and the weight of it felt strange, too light for what it represented. Then I opened the drawer where I kept the old wooden frame. I had made it myself once, in a time when giving meant something, when I still believed that building things for people was the same as belonging to them. I slid the photo in, pressed down each corner, smoothed the surface. But this time I added something new, a small label printed on plain white paper, nothing fancy. But the words were clear, unapologetic, phenol, photographed by Daniel, and paid for by him too. No italics, no decoration, just truth. I carried the frame down the stairs. The hallway lights were still off. No one had stirred. I passed the dining room, the same room where they had held their quiet meeting without me. The air in there still smelled like yesterday's dinner and whispered ambition. I walked to the living room, to the mantelpiece, the one above the fireplace I repaired after it cracked in 2 places, the one they had planned to hang their new family portrait on. I set the frame in the center, not to provoke, but to remind, not of what I'd claimed, but of what had always been true. No ceremony, no announcement, just a photo, a signature, a fact. I stepped back, looked at it, the smiles frozen in that image. So many stories, so many assumptions, but now a new caption, a new truth, finally given its place. And then I turned, walked out of the room, walked past the kitchen, past the old coat rack, past the shoes scattered by the door, none of them mine, and I stepped outside, into the soft light of morning, where silence wasn't suffocating, where air didn't carry secrets. Behind me, the house still slept, but when it woke up, it would have to face the frame, not just the photograph inside it, but the man who finally stepped into it, not with a smile, not with permission, but with the truth and a name. The morning broke slow and gray like it had been holding its breath all night. I rose before anyone else, same as always, not out of habit now, but out of purpose. The old house creaked under my steps as I made my way to the kitchen, carrying only one thing in my hand, a printed copy of the title deed. It was the same paper I had tucked away so many years ago, the same document I had shown in private, whispered over, buried under the weight of family assumptions and silence. But not today. Today I let it speak for itself. I placed it gently on the wooden table, the one I sanded down after it cracked during one New Year's toast, the one where they had celebrated birthdays, argued politics, spilled wine, and never once asked how it stayed standing through 4 generations of wear. I didn't tape it, didn't highlight it, just laid it flat, open, undeniable. Then I walked out onto the porch and sat quietly, letting the morning wrap around me. Through the window I watched the house come alive, the sound of mugs being pulled from cabinets, children dragging sleepy feet across the floor. And then someone saw it. Silence dropped like a sheet. No clatter of cutlery. No shrieks of kids running past. Just the thick, awful quiet of truth, landing where no one expected it. I didn't need to see their faces. I could feel the stillness. The same hands that once waved me off, the same mouths that once said, "He's just helping," were now motionless. Reading, processing, recalculating the foundation beneath their feet. No one asked if it was real. They didn't need to. It was printed on the kind of paper that didn't lie, the kind of paper that outlives stories, family myths, and false memories. Owner of record Daniel M. Reyes, the same name they'd spoken for years without ever asking what it carried. I imagined them passing it between each other, avoiding eye contact. Each of them remembering every moment they left me out. Every moment they smiled for the camera while I stood behind it. Every time they said, "We built this," when I was the only one who poured concrete with his bare hands. No one laughed. There were no jokes this time. No mockery of my silence, no side comments about overreacting, because the picture had changed. Not the photo in the frame, not the physical house, but the story. And stories, once rewritten with truth, don't go back to the old version. They can't. No one asked me to take a picture that day. No one handed me a phone assuming I'd stand aside, because now they knew I wasn't behind the lens anymore. I was the frame, and the foundation, and the name on the paper that held it all together. Let them sit with it. Let them pass it around with shaking hands. Because this, finally, was not my silence. This was my presence. A month passed. The days slipped by like soft rain against glass. Quiet, steady, unannounced. There were no confrontations, no speeches, just a slow, undeniable settling of reality, like dust finally choosing where to land. They didn't speak to me much after that morning. They passed me in hallways with nods that carried more weight than any sentence could hold. Not shame, not anger, just recognition. That alone was new. But I had already begun to leave, not out of resentment, but out of release. Brick by brick, I began again. Not in defiance, in freedom. Just outside the city, on a quiet plot of land with more trees than people, I started building a new house. Nothing grand, nothing showy. Just strong bones, honest walls, and a wide-open space where sunlight could spill in without asking permission. Each nail I hammered echoed with memory. Each board I placed was steadier than the last, not just because of experience, but because of peace. I no longer needed their invitation. I was finally building something where I belonged from the start. One afternoon, as I wiped sawdust from my hands, my phone buzzed with a notification, a message, and a link. At the top of the page, the silent owner, how one man gave and took back with dignity. Underneath, a photo, me, standing in front of the new build, unfinished but real. My hand resting on the frame of the porch, eyes steady, no smile, no performance, just presence. And in the middle of the article, a quote, "Sometimes we build for others because love asks for it, and sometimes we rebuild for ourselves because dignity demands it." It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like something quieter, stronger, reclamation. That same evening, I walked into my modest new living room and set a single frame on the table. The photo. That photo. The one I took of them, still smiling, still lined up, still unaware in that moment of what they were standing on. And I, still behind the camera. But this time, by choice. I looked at the image, felt no ache, no sting, only clarity. Because now the picture told a deeper story. Not just of absence, but of agency. They hadn't left me out. I had stepped aside, not out of weakness, but out of strength to hold the whole thing together while they smiled for the lens. And now I had stepped back in, not to be seen, but to see myself, clearly, fully. I sat beside the photo, poured tea, let the light filter through the half-finished window frames, and I whispered, almost without sound, "You still don't see me in the photo, but now I write the caption." And in this new house, where walls rose from my hands and truth hung in every room, I wasn't just the builder, or the owner, or the photographer. I was the storyteller. And for the first time, the story was mine,